Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna discuss about big orchids and all the hassles of actually owning them. Now, most of us home growers don't necessarily benefit of a lot of space, so we are a little bit prone to choose orchids which don't grow to big length. But sometimes we just get so in love with one particular orchid that happens to be a monster that we simply need to have it. And I belong to that group as well. There is a certain appeal to very big orchids. And furthermore, generally, the bigger the orchid, the bigger the blooms as well. The most popular orchid today is, of course, the Phalaenopsis orchid. The hybrids we can find in stores have especially been created to tolerate and actually do very well in a home environment. And while some really are space savers, others absolutely have no regards for our lack of space. So today we're going to talk about my rules that actually make my life a little easier with these big giants. So rule number 1, think 3D. Now, horizontal is nice, but vertical is practical. So as much as I could, I tried to extend my orchid collection on a vertical level as well. And one of the best solutions that I found is this plant stand. Many of you still ask me about it. I purchased mine from IKEA. The name is Soccer, and I'll link you down below to a video about it. As I understand, IKEA discontinued it, so I did a search on Amazon and eBay, and there are other brands that do absolutely the very same thing. So if you search for plant stand, I think you will be able to find something similar. Okay, so the benefits of actually displaying orchids on a vertical are pretty obvious. They save us a lot of space. Imagine all of these orchids arranged on a horizontal on my shelves. Not to mention the big vandas up there. Hanging them on a bar or even on a coat hanger, I did have this idea, can actually save a lot of space on your shelves. And considering the fact that these orchids tend to get very big and top heavy, keeping them this way will also prevent falling over. The space that a big Phalaenopsis orchid can occupy on a shelf is equivalent to 3 or 4 medium-sized oncidiums, 6 or more orchid seedlings or miniature orchids, or a bucket. But a little trick you can do is think about what's happening under your Phalaenopsis orchid. So next to a Phalaenopsis orchid, and particularly under it, we can place orchids that do require similar light conditions, temperature conditions, or humidity conditions. Choosing orchids that will not grow tall and interfere with the leaves of a big orchid, but rather stay compact, will surely save us a little bit more space on the shelf. If the shelf where we grow our orchids happens to be rather wide, a really great method to save space is to group orchids by height and place the highest plants at the very back of the shelf. So again, we need to keep in mind the requirements of the orchid when it comes to light, temperature, humidity, and other factors, and group orchids with similar needs in regards to the depth of our shelves. Therefore, we can have a setup with very large or tall plants in the back, and as we approach the edge of the shelf, we can place medium orchids, and at the very edge we can place small orchids. Arranging orchids in this manner ensures that all of the orchids receive a decent amount of light. If we would place the same height of orchids one in front of each other, the orchids displayed in the front might shade the orchids in the back. If we, however, arrange them according to height, we can see there is no shading involved, and all of the orchids will receive the adequate amount of light. And by avoiding a space crowded with leaves, we improve ventilation greatly. Rule number 2, shape matters. If we take into account the shape of an orchid and its pattern of growth, we can actually find a more suited place in our growing area for it to develop normally. One such space is the corner of a room. Now, in corners, we don't necessarily put orchids unless we do have a shelf. But corners can actually be a very good place for growing very tall orchids or orchids which have a crawling, and by crawling I mean crawling upwards, type of growth, such as my Vanilla planifolia there. Corners are also a very good place for growing orchids with very tall and slender structures, such as my Dendrobium amethystoglosum here. Now, mind you, this time of the year he is producing flowers, and the weight of the flowers are actually curving the cane. But normally, once this period is over, the orchid has the tendency to grow upright. It creates incredibly tall pseudobulbs, but as you can see, it doesn't really take a lot of space on the horizontal level. So placing this orchid in a bright corner actually helps me save up space on the shelves, but it also ensures that I will not bump into this orchid by mistake, since the canes can get pretty top heavy. Also, if an orchid has the tendency to grow side foliage rather than becoming a compact bush on all sides, I am more inclined to actually keep it on the shelves and place it together with other orchids who have similar patterns, especially on the depth of the shelf. An orchid which tends to grow pretty evenly on all sides will result into more space taking on the shelf. Such an orchid, which doesn't necessarily always have a symmetrical sideways display of foliage, is the Phalaenopsis orchid, and I am more inclined to maintain it on a not so wide shelf. Since the tendency of this orchid is to lean forward, if I would put it on a different shelf, it would take a lot of space in front of it. So if I have a shelf that does not allow me to place anything depth-wise, I am more inclined to place orchids which either lean or become very bushy, and in this way I do gain more space on my deeper shelves. At the moment, my Phalaenopsis orchid are no longer on this shelf because, well, they have to create flower spikes as well, and the spikes are not tiny either. Which brings me to rule number 3, tidying up orchids wherever it's possible and wherever we actually want to. Now, Phalaenopsis spikes can be quite large and usually have the tendency to arch and become pendant, but we can also train them to be more upright. And when you purchase Phalaenopsis orchids, you will discover they are actually displayed in such way, and this is because they take up less space. But then there comes the personal preference. If you are not necessarily a fan of upright flower spikes, then of course you can let them be pendant. But this will now result into space saved. A solution for that would be to arrange these types of orchids on the edge of a shelf. So you let the flower spike arch down and become as big as possible. Keep in mind, whatever sticks out of the shelf is very prone to be bumped over or brushed against and so on. So be very careful how you move around your orchids. Which brings me to number 4. Be careful around big orchids. The bigger orchid structures are, the more we are prone to accidents. Placing orchids that are medium-sized or even smaller sized on eye level actually is a little bit safer. If for whatever reason you want to pick up your orchid, look at it, or go to the sink and water it, if you have very big and bushy orchids on eye level, you are more prone to damaging them, because your hands come on a horizontal plane, so they will inevitably take space on the sides of the pot as well. If on the sides of the pot we have some other big foliage orchids, when we maneuver our orchids we can seriously damage the orchids around them. To make things a little bit safer, I have a tendency to place bigger orchids on shelves which are not eye level. In this instance, if I would like to remove an orchid from this shelf, I would not have to pick it up like this. I would have to pick it up like this. My hands absolutely don't take a lot of space and don't interfere with the orchids around them, so I can safely remove one of the orchids. Also, when maneuvering big orchids, make sure that you don't maneuver multiple big orchids at the same time. The bigger the orchid, the less comfortable it is to actually pick it up, and not to mention the heavier it is. You're more prone to dropping orchids if you struggle to pick up multiple orchids at the same time. So it is a little bit safer to get one orchid at a time. Rule number 5, the bigger orchids are, the heavier and actually stronger they are. So you should provide for this from the beginning. Some big orchids have the tendency to lean forward or in a certain direction as they grow, and this can make them very unstable in their pot. If we're using plastic pots in a light medium such as bark, the more big structures we have in an orchid, the more unstable it will get, so we need to find ways of stabilizing it. If we think about it from the beginning, we can make a decision if we can change one of the variables. For example, a clay pot will be very heavy, therefore the chances of the orchid actually falling over under its weight are minimized. Also, providing a heavy decorative pot for the plastic pot can also prevent orchids from falling. The bigger an orchid is, the more strength it will have as well, and let me tell you what I mean. So here I have my extremely big and great convechi. As you can see, the roots are pretty thick, but more important than that, the roots of this orchid are really powerful. An indication of that is the leaves of this orchid, which are incredibly strong. Now, when roots form, they need to pierce through this layer of leaves, and to pierce through them, they need incredible strength. Now, how can this be a problem? Well, because the roots are just so powerful, there is a serious risk when it comes to the pot. Let me just show you what happens to my pot. As the roots grow inside the pot, they are starting to crack open this pot. The last time I showed you this crack, it was not this big. And ever since then, yet another crack appeared on the other side. In time, my pot will simply give up and it will crack open, therefore I need to do something really fast about this orchid. If I were to know this detail, and if I were to do this all over again, I would definitely not pot this orchid into a cheap ceramic pot. The reason why the pot is cracking is because it's not flexible, but it is very, very porous and easy to break. So if I would have taken this detail into account when I potted this orchid, I wouldn't be forced to disturb this orchid right now, particularly that it's forming a flower spike. Now, the place where this orchid sits is on that shelf, which is absolutely not ideal because if you look from a certain angle, you can see my shelf is already curved. The bigger orchids are, the heavier they will be as well, and the more they grow and more structures they create, things will only get worse. If you can, make sure you reinforce the shelves or simply grow these orchids on the actual floor or on a stand of their own. And in garden centers, there are those wire stands that are really beautiful and quite classy, and they're designed to only hold one orchid. All of this being said, there is a real charm about very big orchids. And I don't know about you guys, but even though I don't want to have a lot of big orchids, when I look at something as majestic as this, I am simply amazed and bewildered and fascinated and happy that I have the possibility to own it. So let me know down below what orchid monsters you have and how you manage them. Also, let us know about the problems you've encountered and how you solved them. So thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for daily orchids and plants videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye! Now, currently, the Phalaenopsis orchid is the most... So the electricity just went down, I don't have light. The forces of the universe are not with me today.